What did it take to build on Canada's potential? Imagine nearly 10 million square kilometers, looking out on 3 different oceans. Canada's first leaders imagined it, and they weren't intimidated. They were motivated. Motivated to build a national infrastructure from scratch. Motivated to think not about the next quarter, but about the next century. Motivated to connect Canada to the promise of its future. To connect it by rail. To connect it by road. To connect it by air. To connect it by water. To connect it with energy. To connect it by voice. Here in the 21st century, we need to connect to our potential in new ways. Because it's clear Canada's future will be very different from its past. Today, our challenges are economic. They're environmental. They're societal. Through a reimagined infrastructure, we can meet those challenges head-on by recognizing brilliant ideas, no matter where they come from, and by embracing possibility instead of fearing risk. In return, we'll have a nation that's ready for its growing urban populations, a nation that uses technology to change things for the better, a nation that respects and includes all its peoples, a nation whose most valuable natural resource will soon be brain power. The time for transformational infrastructure is now. So join us, because Canada is too big to think small.
Thank you, Jacqueline, Doug, and Norm. I couldn't agree more with the fact that we are looking at more and more complex solutions to our infrastructure needs, and therefore the process, how we get there and make the right decisions and get the benefits, is also more complex. So now it's my pleasure and privilege to announce the Can Infra Challenge. You've heard about it a little bit. It is really our goal in our process going forward to ask you, your friends, your organizations to bring forward the most transformational opportunities that you see for Canada. It will take dialogue and it will take some great level of thinking, some of which started this morning, some of which is in the room, in the institutions, in the organizations that you run or that you're part of. And the point of the challenge is to bring it all together and then have, over the next 6 months, a process where we accept the ideas, we'll screen the ideas, we'll shortlist a set of strong ideas and leaders, and then we have a summit in 6 months, not in 6 years, a summit where that will be presented. And the goal there is really that we can have a joint dialogue around the kernels that exist, but actually be much more specific and inspire the thinking of our nation, inspire the thinking of our cities and city regions, and hopefully really feed the pipeline of transformational ideas that this country needs. Thank you again to the sponsors for today and for the challenge: Brookfield, RBC, CIBC, Deloitte, and Tories. And as mentioned before, the Globe and Mail is the media partner. And this idea actually emerged out of a conversation David Walmsley and I had somewhere early in this year in January. And the Globe and Mail is very committed to make this national debate a live debate. So you'll see a lot of postings, a lot of opportunity for you to participate and encourage that this dialogue is one that really takes us a big, big step forward. More on the challenge you'll see on the various media properties. As a next step now, it's my honor to introduce my friend and the Honorable Bill Morneau. Bill, as you know, is an MP for Toronto Centre, which is pretty much exactly here, where we are in this beautiful building with all the elements of the weather. And of course, he's our Minister of Finance. After a very successful career in business, Bill has turned his energy toward helping Canada be a stronger and a more inclusive economy. As Minister of Finance, Bill has emphasized enhancing Canadian infrastructure as a way to strengthen our long-term economic prosperity. Bill, thank you for coming today. I know it was tight, but you made it ahead of the weather and the storm, so thank you for that. And thank you for sharing your vision about infrastructure in Canada with us.
Well, thank you, Killian, and thank you, all of you, for being here today. I'd like to thank BCG and the Globe and Mail and Brookfield and all the sponsors for hosting what I think is a really important event. I'd also like to thank you for hosting it today. I'm not in Ottawa today, which is, from my perspective, pretty great. Yesterday, I had the exciting time of talking to all of our premiers and territorial leaders about taxes, and then talking to the entire House of Commons for about an hour about taxes, and then talking to the Senate chamber for about an hour and 15 minutes about taxes. So I'm particularly pleased to be here today to talk about infrastructure. But of course, if you have questions about taxes, I'm also happy to talk about that when I finish. I really wanted to start today by setting the overall frame from all of our perspective, from Canada's perspective. We are, as a country, in a good place. We've, over the last year, had growth that's been better than it's been in a decade in our country. The last quarter, in particular, was remarkably strong, with about 4.5% growth. We've experienced, over the last year, growth in jobs, about 400,000 new jobs over the course of the last year. Most of those full-time. We are in the lowest unemployment situation than we've been in for more than a decade. So our economy is doing well. But I think we start there and think about some of the challenges that we're facing. So just a couple of years ago, we had an election in our country. And one of the things that we pointed out was that we thought that we needed to deal with what we saw as a significant level of anxiety among Canadians. Primarily financial anxiety, but broad-based anxiety. We were at that stage in 2015 experiencing a number of issues that were global in nature. We had a big change in oil prices and some things that we needed to deal with. We had, in 2015, a rate of growth in our country of 0.9% and a level of anxiety that was growing. And we saw, subsequent to that, of course, that anxiety was not limited to Canada. So our prescription, which was to make significant investments, both in our long-term productivity, but also in showing Canadians that they can be better off in the near term, and we hope for the long term, were really important. We started off by saying we needed to deal with the sense of anxiety that Canadians were facing in order to build confidence. So we lowered taxes on middle-class Canadians. Most importantly, we introduced the Canada Child Benefit for Canadians, which meant that for the average Canadian, for 9 out of 10 Canadians with families, they're about $2,300 after tax better off now. So that was really an important signature effort that we put in place in order to fundamentally change the level of confidence that Canadians had in their economy, to fundamentally change child poverty in this country, because this year we'll have about 40% less child poverty than we had before the Canada Child Benefit came into place. And importantly, change the level of confidence that people had to make investments in themselves and their families that's really helped us to bring us to where we are today, with a much different sense of our economic opportunities, with multiple things acting together. So obviously things like the Canada Child Benefit being critically important, but also a rebound in terms of what we're seeing in Alberta. Also a global situation that's better. Also a situation where housing continues to have a positive impact on our economy. So we are in a place now where we need to think about how do we move forward to make sure that the kind of confidence that's emerging, that the kind of success that's emerging can be put in place for the longer term. So you'll remember that we talked about infrastructure as a key element of our investments for the future. We said that we needed to double down on the kinds of things that we can do that can create a difference over the long term. We came into office observing that with the lowest net debt to GDP among G7 countries, we had a balance sheet that gave us the capacity to make long-term investments in our country. Investments that would help our productivity over the long term, investments that would improve our economy in the short and medium term as well. So we said that we'd invest $180 billion over 12 years, an enormous statement of confidence in our future and an enormous impact on the long-term capacity of our economy. But we knew that it wasn't going to be enough. Estimates vary, but one point estimate that we've seen is about a $570 billion deficit in terms of infrastructure in this country. And while some people would say, well, couldn't governments do all of that? As people in this room will know, we already have a lot of assets on the federal government balance sheet, on the provincial government balance sheets, even on the municipal government balance sheets. We already have needs to upkeep assets that we already maintain that are significant. So there's always a challenge in being able to do what we need to do with the amount of resources we have. And of course, we need to be fiscally responsible along the way. So really with that observation was born the idea that we should think about new and different ways to approach our infrastructure challenge. The observation that funds around the world, pension funds, investment funds around the world were looking for long-term infrastructure assets was obvious. The realization that we continue to be in a low-for-long interest rate environment was obvious. But the question is, how do we take those two issues for the funds? How do we marry that with our need to actually have a transformational impact? We realized that if we could attract those institutional investors into Canadian infrastructure in a much more significant way than we've done in the past, we could have a more important impact over the long term. Thus was born our idea. The challenge, of course, is figuring out how to make that idea work. We went out and spoke to institutional funds, and what we heard from them was, it's not always easy to make infrastructure investments around the world. Of course, there's political risks in parts of the world. But it's more than just political risks. There was a risk from their standpoint of actually completing projects, starting down the due diligence road and being able to get to completion, because they realized that it's tough for governments to actually go forward with long-term infrastructure projects. They said that it wasn't good enough to have one project in a country. They needed to have a pipeline of projects. If a fund is going to make an investment for the long term in a country, they need to know that that investment is not in one project, that they're going to have enough opportunity to move forward over the long term. What we realized from a government standpoint is that it's often hard to get to conclusion on infrastructure projects. You heard some of the reasons here today on the stage. In our country, we have multiple levels of government that have to get to agreement. We have other issues, though, that are also challenges. Governments need to have confidence that they're getting into a project that's going to be long-term successful for the country. And the challenge with that is having that level of financial acumen to know that it's actually going to be a good deal for governments is a necessary condition for a government to move forward. It's also important to find a way for governments to work together with different levels so that we can all get to consensus on how we might be able to move forward. And the pipeline's not that easy to get to. We know that getting to the projects that can have the biggest, most significant impact is fraught with disagreements on what that might be. Those disagreements are often political and sometimes local, but they're challenging in any way. So what we're trying to think about is how do we deal with both those two issues? So from those two issues, the issues from the governments, the issues from the investors, really was born the idea of the Canada Infrastructure Bank. We saw that by taking some of the money that was to be put into infrastructure and instead putting it toward an infrastructure bank would allow us to think about how we could make projects that were perhaps not quite economically viable, more likely to be economically viable over the long term. It might allow us to take projects that one level of government wouldn't see as being necessarily their first best and move it across the finish line. So we said that what we would do is take $15 billion out of that $180 billion and add another $20 billion of what we call reinvestable capital for the Canada Infrastructure Bank. The idea being that we would have in that institution a repository of expertise, of financial expertise that could act as the bridge between institutions and government to come up with ideas that were going to be financially viable. There was going to be financial instruments that would allow projects that needed to get off the drawing board and into the actual phase of being implemented, that would get them across the finish line. And we'd be able to do that with an institution that would give confidence to multiple levels of government. So that's where we found ourselves. We know that the Canada Infrastructure Bank will not be for all projects. We know that federal government, provincial governments, municipal governments, territorial governments, working together with Indigenous peoples in many cases, will still have many projects that won't be the kinds of projects for the Canada Infrastructure Bank. So as we look at that $180 billion commitment over a dozen years, we've taken $15 billion out, which means we still have a significant amount of money to spend on those projects. But we want to make sure we get at the transformational projects. We know that back to the original idea of thinking about how we deal with that long-term anxiety that Canadians face, the anxiety that we look towards the future with a question of what the jobs are going to be and whether we're going to have the capacity to compete internationally. We know that having the infrastructure in our country in all dimensions is going to be critical as a building block for our likely to be success. We think building confidence among Canadians that we as a country can meet up to the challenges that we face of tomorrow. So that's where we are today in terms of our progress on the Canada Infrastructure Bank thinking. And I want to tell you we've made really good progress as well in terms of actually getting forward to get the bank off the ground. We have Jim Leach, who's been helping us from the federal government standpoint in acting as really a key project manager. I don't know how much we'd pay him as a project manager, Norm, but he's doing a really good job so far. Well, that's what he's actually getting paid, but I think we'd be willing to pay more, Jim. But he's helping us to actually get the project off the ground. We've chosen a chair of the board, Janice Fukakasa, who is leading our efforts to build a board that can be world-class in this institution. We are in the midst of completing our selection of a chief executive officer for the institution going forward. So we're making progress to get this institution off the ground this calendar year. And we feel confident that we're going to make the progress that we expected to make in that regard. I will tell you, though, that most importantly is not just that we get that architecture off the ground, but it's that we think about what are the projects that we're going to get to, what are the things that we're going to do that are actually going to have that long-term transformational impact on our country. And so that's why today is so important. We know that finding a way to get ideas from across the country, ideas that may well be ones that have been in our levels of government over years or may not be, ideas that think about the challenges of tomorrow and help us to get to a place where we actually have a different kind of opportunity for the next generation than we've had for this generation. So I'm very excited about this process. I know that we'll make an enormous impact over the long term if we can get the kind of ideas that really can be used as the bank moves forward to make a difference for all of us. So I want to thank everyone again for their participation today. I hope that you'll be encouraged to continue to feed these ideas in and take the challenge up. It's an important one. It's certainly one that we in government are going to watch very closely to make sure that we're part of the agenda of that long-term difference. So thank you for having me here today. I am, I think, going to stay up on stage to answer some questions on infrastructure or taxes, and happy to be part of this event today.
Very good. So we have indeed quite a bit of time for some questions. So please prepare a question, raise your arm. There are people are going to run microphones around so that we are ready and you have a microphone right away. I'm going to take the privilege of asking the first question. We talked this morning quite a bit about the fact that all the forces would draw us naturally to incrementalism. There is the challenge that we have existing infrastructure gaps that we need to fill urgently, so it's hard to actually think 30 or 50 years ahead. There is a challenge around the funding model that everyone has a little bit of funding, and so it gets often peanut butter spread rather than focused. There's a challenge around the return model. There's a challenge around user pay, acceptance, and so on. So I think we're in a world where actually, you know, the reality would draw us to do smaller incremental things. And yet, as you point out, and I think the whole room here feels, we have a desire to something much more big, breakthrough, transformational. So the question is, how do you personally think across the levels of government, between the public and private sector, between the operators of existing infrastructure that in some cases becomes obsolete or less useful when we build something new, how are we going to change the governance and decision-making process to achieve some of these transformational solutions?
Well, I think the people in this room are, to a great extent, I'm sure, experts on this subject. So we all understand that this is hard. This won't be straightforward. We have challenges that were pointed out in terms of our regulatory approach. We have challenges in terms of coordinating with different levels of government. These are real challenges, and we don't want to minimize those challenges. But we also have an understanding that working together is the only way we can move forward on this. I can tell you that the cooperation from the municipal and provincial and federal government on the issues around the Canada Infrastructure Bank has been exceptionally positive. That's working well. We think that by developing the expertise in one place that can tell people what the advantage is over the long term, finding projects that are clearly able to be financed through the use of other money provides an enormous impetus for action. And then the money that we're putting into the infrastructure bank, we believe will allow us to move some projects into the profitable category that wouldn't necessarily be in the profitable category. So the idea really is that expertise allows us to get, we hope, to a sense of agreement among multiple levels of government. And then once that happens, and that goal is to have that happen as early as possible in the process, that we then charge the infrastructure bank with the ability to move forward on actually getting something done. So we take it as best we can, and it's not able to be taken out of the political realm entirely, because politics will always be a place, will be a place where we'll be thinking about infrastructure. But at the earliest stage possible, take it out, so the infrastructure bank can literally sign financial deals with investors, and that will create an impetus for us to move forward on projects. It's something that we believe we can move forward on. There are obviously going to be moving parts. Getting at the first big projects early and successfully, I think, will be critically important to our long-term success with this venture. But I'm encouraged and optimistic that we can get there.
Very good. One question back here, and then one up there.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. My name is Amar Nawaz. I'm with Hydro One, and also the Vice Chair of PEO West Toronto. Just building on your last thoughts, and when we talk about transformational infrastructure, I'm wondering, does it still make sense to be planning infrastructure at the municipal or the city level, whereas the economic activity today does not constrain us in those bounds? And how do you bring about that fundamental change? And in connection with that, it is true that municipalities feel the lack of the infrastructure firsthand, but when you look at the revenue streams that they have at their disposal, they're not adequate for them to do any meaningful action. So how do you involve different levels of the government to make that change right at the fundamental level?
Well, I think your fundamental observation is one of the things that led us to get here. A recognition that building infrastructure at the municipal level is a challenge, given that most of the really critical infrastructure that we might need is going to transcend more than one municipality. So the idea that we're going to have multiple municipalities work together to get a project off the ground, and then they're going to seek provincial support, and then potentially they're going to seek federal support, makes a level of complexity that helps me to understand why the woman from SNC-Lavalin expressed some challenge around our ability to get things done. So that's actually where we're coming at with this. This is why this idea might have been good in and of itself without the financial funding that we put forward, but by putting not only the expertise in one place, but also the financial ability to engineer projects that would use that funding and outside funding, we create a different model. So all of a sudden the municipalities, they will need to, of course, give up some level of control over that infrastructure asset, and the returns will need to go to the people in kind that have put the funding forward. But it makes it plausible to do things that just wouldn't otherwise be able to be done. So that's essentially the goal, and we are hoping that through forums like this and other idea generation activities, people come forward with ideas that are transformational and that do transcend boundaries. Some of the most interesting projects will probably even transcend our national boundary, because those projects could be the ones that have the biggest impact on our economy by enabling organizations to be successful cross-border. So we know that this idea of boundaries is more of an obstacle than an advantage, and this, we think, is one way of enabling us to overcome that obstacle.
Very good. Over there, please.
Minister Morneau, my name is John Banka. I'm a graduate student in engineering at the University of Toronto, and I graduated in November. Earlier today, I had raised the issue of us having a national electricity corridor right across the country. And the issue that I want to raise is that you probably just touched on it, the fact that we don't have free trade amongst the provinces. And if we did put an electricity corridor across the country, electricity is handled by the provinces. So we're probably going to end up with a fuss at each border. We now have a case going to the Supreme Court about alcohol in New Brunswick. So there's the tax angle. We also had several years ago, Newfoundland wasn't able to transmit electricity across Quebec because Quebec objected. So what will happen in these cases? Will the federal government support applications for electricity being transported across the country?
Well, I guess the way I would start is we've got a pretty great country. We, as many of you travel around the world, we see the challenges that so many other countries face, and we come back home and realize that, our quality of life is really high, our ability to have a harmonious discussion about national challenges is in excess of what so many other countries have. So we are very fortunate, I think, to have that as our situation. And of course we have challenges. The fact that we can't move beer from one province to the other, well, yeah, I suppose that's a challenge, and it's something that we need to get at. The fact that we have interprovincial barriers is an important challenge in this country. We know that we could raise our GDP in one fell swoop if we could somehow eliminate interprovincial tariffs. But it's actually just not that easy. We're working at it. We're trying to get the provinces on board to changes one by one by one. We feel like we've made some progress even in the time we've been in office. Governments before us made efforts to do this as well. This is not a partisan issue. We're going to continue to do that. I think that the idea that we come up with a project that has economic viability, that changes the potential for actually making a real difference because we've brought in $5 for every dollar of government funding, and that's sitting waiting to be done, will be a very important impetus for change. So how we do that will of course be up to what the project is and the nature of the benefits and the challenges from a province to province basis. Electricity obviously being one that presents particular challenges in particular parts of the country. But my thinking on this would be, let's have that problem. Let's find the project that will force us to confront the problem. So we have to go out and say the only way we can get this project done, which will have this amount of impact on our economy, which will have this amount of impact on the cost of electricity for citizens, is by dealing with this challenging issue of interprovincial jurisdiction. I want that problem.
Well, Minister Morneau, I have such a project. That's why I'm here today. So maybe you'll hear from me in the future.
Excellent. Thank you. We have a question over here on this end of the room.
Thank you, Minister. My name is Lynn Dolan. I'm president of the Association of Municipalities of Ontario, and we represent almost all of Ontario's 444 municipalities. So I just wanted to reiterate the comment from Hydro One regarding revenue sources, and to let you know that municipalities in Ontario, we maintain, repair, refurbish more infrastructure than either the federal or the provincial governments. And of all the taxes that people pay, be it income tax, gas tax, property tax, 9 cents goes to the municipalities. So, and the other myth I would like to break is that municipalities are very good at working with their partners. We have lots of examples of sharing infrastructure, be it water and wastewater treatment plants, police services, lots of infrastructure can be shared. But my question, Mr. Morneau, is out of those 440 municipalities, about 60% of them have a population of under 10,000 people. And how would they be able to access the infrastructure bank?
It's a good question, and we've obviously focused on different ways we can impact different infrastructure issues across the country. I think this conference is here to think about projects that can have an impact that will be significant across the country, and that probably, in many cases, will preclude it from considering smaller projects. And I think that presents a question for smaller jurisdictions. I guess I'd have two potential answers to that. First, I'd remind, at least from the federal perspective, the size of the investment that we're proposing into the Canada Infrastructure Bank. Of the $180 billion of expendable capital, I'd call it that, over a dozen years, we're talking about $165 billion of it being continued on the model that's typically been the case, which is the federal government puts in its share, the provincial government puts in its share, and the municipal government puts in its share. And I know there'll continue to be debate about what those shares should be, but that model, of course, allows us to amplify the impact of federal government investment. So that will continue, and that may well not answer your question about what might come from the infrastructure bank, but there's other sources of funds. Secondly, our hope is that as we move forward with the infrastructure bank, that we will see that there are some projects that are not just one project that is dealing across municipalities, but it might be that there's a bundling of similar kinds of projects that are financially viable for an investor or an investor group to consider as an asset that they might want to own. So that might allow us to consider what 10 municipalities might want to do on wastewater systems, bundle it together and find a way to use that as a project that might be successful from the infrastructure bank's standpoint. So the devil is in the details. I think we do have funds that are set aside for projects, and we do have ideas on how the infrastructure bank can be part of that. So we'll see what comes forward, and that process of getting the great projects forward is not really one that's meant to just be top-down, but to be bottom-up and coming from all directions. And hopefully some of those will be ones that will answer the question from the perspective of smaller jurisdictions.
Very good. One last question, if it's very short.
Thank you. I wasn't expecting it to come to me. Thank you very much, Minister, for your very forward-looking comments. One of the aspects of the bank is the potential for revenue generation. So some of the themes we've been talking about this morning are energy efficiency and so forth. So as a sliver, and as our colleague from AMO said, municipalities tend to rely on gas taxes, but in the future, we're getting into more fuel-efficient vehicles. There's a big push on with various provinces for electric vehicles. So the model that I think we have to shift to, but will take a lot of political leadership to do so, is things like road pricing to get the private sector involved in these projects. So could you comment on that leadership aspect and the types of tools you might be in favor of?
Well, I've already tried to put through tax changes, and I'm working hard on that. So I'm not sure that I can withstand any further scar tissue at this stage. to tell you what I think about road tolls. What I can say is that I expect that what will happen is that people will come forward with ideas on how we can make projects work. And those ideas, I expect, will consider the kinds of things that you're identifying, revenue generation opportunities for those infrastructure projects that allow them to be successful over the long term. Hopefully having other benefits, perhaps environmental benefits or just effectiveness in terms of people getting around in some cases, that will have to be considered. So part of the rationale for putting forth the idea like the Canada Infrastructure Bank is those ideas will be generated from sources that are coming at it from a different angle than governments might do. We might find that a project that is very, very attractive from an infrastructure standpoint, from actually helping people, is one that has no model that doesn't include some sort of revenue generation activity that might have not been under consideration previously. We can't have these debates without the ideas. We can't guarantee where the debates will end, but I think having the debate will get us to a much better conclusion than if we don't, and probably will enable us to find, a path that will work. There's more than one path to success in most projects, and having multiple options is something that we hope the expertise that might be in the Infrastructure Bank would allow us to get there. So again, Killian, thank you for your leadership in putting this together and for all the people that have been part of it. And we certainly are excited about this idea and hoping that it will have an impact that will transcend political time cycles and really be important for us and for the next generation of Canadians.
We
Thanks.
believe in the room this is just the beginning, and we thank you for laying out a very clear agenda and commitment to infrastructure. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you very much for agreeing to come here and take a short break from talking about small business tax changes. I know it was hard to wrench yourself away, but I appreciate you doing that. I want to thank